Welcome. You're listening because you want deep understanding, fast. No wasted words, just the core insights.
That's the goal.
Today, we're diving into something pretty heavy. The potential conflict brewing between China and Taiwan. Specifically, the role of semiconductors.
Yeah, the chip manufacturing aspect, it's huge.
Exactly. So our mission here is to explore whether Taiwan's dominance in making these advanced chips actually makes it, a potential trigger for war, a war that could even pull in the U.S.
And we're drawing on some interesting points raised in a discussion featuring Andrew Bustamante, trying to piece together that puzzle.
Okay, so let's start with the core issue,
Yeah.
the semiconductor situation.
Right. I mean, the first thing that jumps out is just how concentrated it is. Taiwan isn't just a player in advanced chips.
They're the player.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
For the really cutting-edge stuff, they're way ahead. And the source we looked at highlights that, well, neither the U.S. nor Europe has really caught up domestically.
They haven't built that capacity at scale.
No. And apparently, other countries in Southeast Asia aren't exactly rushing to jump into that very specific, very advanced niche either.
Which leads to the big question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you're the world's indispensable chip factory, and you're sitting right next door to a major power like China, does that basically paint a giant target on your back?
It's a fair question, especially given the insane global demand for these semiconductors. Everything runs on them.
Everything. Your phone, your car, military tech. So one island effectively controls the supply. Now, the discussion we're pulling from takes an interesting turn here. It suggests we need to look beyond just politics when we think about why wars start.
Right. It brings up the economic angle. The argument being that wars fundamentally are often driven by economics, not just ideals or grievances.
Okay, let's unpack that. Economics is the root cause.
Yeah, and the source gives some historical examples to chew on. Think about the first Gulf War.
Oil.
Definitely a major factor, securing those oil supplies. Or even going back further, the Napoleonic Wars, often seen as about power and ideology, but
There were huge economic elements, right? Like the British blockades against France, trying to strangle their trade.
exactly, economic warfare. The core idea here, according to the source, is that actual military conflict is just incredibly expensive.
The most expensive thing nations do, probably.
Right. In terms of lives, resources, opportunity cost. So for a state to engage in that, there usually needs to be some prospect of, well, significant economic gain or avoiding a massive economic loss.
That makes sense. It reframes it slightly.
Yeah.
And you can see that logic playing out today, perhaps.
Well, the source points towards the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Beyond the political narratives, there are undeniable economic dimensions. Access to resources, ports, strategic land.
Things that have economic value. There's that quote mentioned. Something like, if goods don't cross borders.
Soldiers will.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really captures that link, doesn't it? Threaten economic ties, block trade, and the risk of military action goes up. It's about who gains or loses economically.
Which brings us to a really fascinating side discussion in the source material. Decentralized finance. Like Bitcoin.
Ah, yes. The idea that maybe, just maybe, something like Bitcoin could change the incentives for war.
How so?
Well, the argument goes, if wealth can be held in a way that's really difficult, maybe almost impossible, for an invading power to just seize.
Like digital assets they can't easily confiscate.
Exactly. If you can't just roll in and steal the gold or the oil rights or control the central bank quite so easily, does that make the whole prospect of invasion less economically attractive?
Takes away some of the potential profit motive. It's an interesting thought. Definitely changes the calculus.
It does. Now, related to the cost of war, the discussion also draws a distinction between different types of conflict, which I thought was quite useful.
Yeah, not all wars are the same. What was the distinction?
Between interstate war, that's nation, versus nation, sovereign states fighting each other.
Like U.S. and Afghanistan or Russia-Ukraine now. Classic examples.
Right. And intrastate war conflict within a single country. Think civil wars, like Syria.
Okay. And the point about interstate war was the cost.
Astronomical cost, yes. The source really hammers this home. The logistics, the manpower, the economic disruption. Think World War II, the Gulf War, even the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The sheer scale is immense.
Got it. So interstate is hugely expensive. What about intrastate, like Syria?
Well, the discussion highlights Syria as a really interesting, maybe disturbing case study, especially considering what's happened recently.
With Syria being brought back into the Arab League.
Exactly. Here you have Bashar al-Assad, a leader who faced massive international outcry, chemical weapons use, the whole red line thing.
Which seemed like a clear point of no return at the time.
It did, but he's still in power.
Yeah.
And now Syria is being somewhat reintegrated regionally. The source suggests this outcome. Well, I might send a signal
The signal to whom?
to other authoritarian leaders, perhaps, like Putin, like Xi Jinping. The suggestion is maybe they look at Syria and think the international community's resolve to enforce its stated values or intervene effectively isn't as strong as they thought.
That the consequences for certain actions might be manageable.
Potentially. It kind of challenges the narrative of democracy inevitably triumphing everywhere, doesn't it? Seeing these kinds of outcomes.
It does make you question things. And this ties into another point raised about how different government structures might affect military capability.
Yeah, the centralized versus decentralized power thing.
Like comparing free market democracies with more authoritarian states.
The idea explored is that while decentralized systems like free markets and democracies are great at innovation and wealth creation, they might be, well, less agile militarily.
You mean because of things like political debate, checks and balances, potential gridlock, like we see sometimes in the U.S.?
Exactly.
Oh.
Compared to, say, China, where the centralized structure might allow for much faster decision-making and resource mobilization, especially for state directives like military buildups.
So it's a trade-off. Economic dynamism versus potentially slower military or strategic responsiveness.
That's the tension presented, yeah. Maybe a perceived weakness in terms of rapid unified action.
Okay, so if decentralized currencies, like Bitcoin, are seen by some states as potentially undermining their power or making them harder to fund, then the next logical step discussed is the state's response. Central bank, digital currencies, CBDCs.
Right. This comes up as the state-controlled alternative. There seems to be a general agreement, according to the source, that the underlying technology blockchain is powerful, especially combined with AI.
So the tech itself isn't the issue for the state.
Not necessarily. The issue with decentralized cryptocurrencies from a state perspective is twofold, based on the discussion. First, the association with illicit activities.
Like money laundering, drugs, human trafficking.
Yeah.
The source mentioned fentanyl specifically, early adopters using it for bad stuff.
Exactly. That creates a negative perception and a justification for regulation or bans. Second, and maybe more fundamentally for the state,
Taxes.
taxes and control. It's much harder for a government to track, tax, and ultimately derive revenue and exert control over truly decentralized systems. And that revenue is what funds the state, its policies, its power.
Which makes China's approach make perfect sense from their perspective.
It does. The source uses China as the prime example. They didn't just regulate crypto, they outright banned mining and trading while pushing their own digital yuan, the ECNY.
The CBDC.
Yes. And they're already rolling it out, using it for things like paying state workers, but it's also seen as a tool for much greater surveillance and social engineering.
Linking it to things like their social credit system.
That's the implication. A centralized digital currency gives the state immense visibility and control over citizens' financial lives.
Okay, but the source must have included counter-arguments to those criticisms of decentralized currencies, right? It can't all be negative.
Oh, absolutely. On the illicit use point, the counter is pretty straightforward. Any powerful tool can be misused.
Like the U.S. dollar.
Exactly. Cash, especially U.S. dollars, has fueled global crime for decades. Nobody suggests banning the dollar because criminals use it. So blaming the tool, like Bitcoin, is seen as missing the point.
And the tax argument, that it can't be taxed.
The pushback there is interesting. Some proponents of decentralized finance basically argue that, well, maybe less tax extraction is a good thing. They might view taxation itself as coercive.
As a form of theft, some argue.
That's a more extreme view, yes. But the core idea is that leaving more wealth in the productive private market rather than being extracted by the state could actually boost overall prosperity.
Let the market work more freely.
Right. And there's also a point mentioned, particularly within the Bitcoin community, that maybe Bitcoin is the only truly decentralized and secure blockchain out there, distinguishing it from other crypto projects.
Okay, so we have this tension. State control versus individual freedom, centralized versus decentralized systems. The discussion then introduces a framework to think about this. The social triangle.
Yeah, it's a way to visualize the trade-offs societies make. At one point of the triangle, you have pure individualism. High freedom, maybe, but potentially low efficiency because there's less coordination.
Everyone for themselves, basically.
Sort of. Then you move to tribalism. You give up some individual freedom to belong to a group, That brings cooperation, trade within the tribe, more efficiency, but often conflict between tribes.
Us versus them.
Exactly. And then at the top of the triangle, you have the state. You give up even more individual freedom
In exchange for what?
in exchange for centralized efficiencies, policing, courts, infrastructure, maybe social welfare programs, national defense. The state provides these things, but it requires resources and compliance
Control.
and control. And the source argues the state has a built-in incentive to keep its population, well, reasonably satisfied, but also distracted.
Ah, the old bread and circuses idea. Keep people fed and entertained so they don't question the system too much.
That's the concept. Focus on day-to-day life, minor issues, entertainment, not the fundamental structures of power.
Which leads into probably the most provocative point in the source material.
The comparison to slavery.
Yeah. Posing the question, is the modern state, in a way, a form of modern slavery? It's a really strong claim.
It is provocative. The argument isn't that it's identical to historical chattel slavery, obviously. The key difference highlighted is the opportunity for social mobility, even if it's difficult for many.
But the parallel being drawn is,
That you're born into a system, the state, where a significant portion of your labor, your economic output, is essentially claimed by the state through taxes and regulations, a sort of forced contribution to the collective system you didn't explicitly choose to join.
you're born into citizenship and its obligations.
Right. The source uses the example of the UAE, technically a democracy, but heavily reliant on foreign workers who often have limited rights and whose labor benefits the citizens. It's presented as a modern system with elements that echo historical exploitation, even if the form is different.
So it's framing war and these systems of societal control and resource extraction as sort of recurring patterns in human history, just changing forms.
That seems to be the underlying perspective presented. These dynamics persist.
And then there's the final piece about distraction. How does that fit in?
It ties back to the bread and circuses idea. The argument is that sometimes focusing heavily on certain issues, even important historical injustices like past slavery.
Which definitely needs acknowledgement and understanding.
Absolutely. But the argument suggests that an overemphasis, particularly when directed by certain interests, can serve to distract people from contemporary power structures or economic inequalities that are affecting them now.
So keep people arguing about the past to stop them from changing the present.
Or distracting specific demographics. The source specifically mentions targeting the, let's say, the 35 to 50-year-old demographic.
Why them specifically?
Because they're often the highest income earners, the most economically productive part of society. So the idea is keep them busy and distracted. Through the news cycle, social media outrage, political polarization, but also just the demands of life, career building, raising families, mortgages, keep their heads down, focused on the immediate, not the bigger picture.
And this is framed as almost a deliberate strategy, like influence campaigns.
The source connects it to covert influence tactics. Yes, distraction as a tool of control.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this all up, we've journeyed from semiconductors in Taiwan
The potential flashpoint.
through the idea that war is fundamentally economic, the potential disruption from decentralized finance, the nature of state power, control, even modern slavery concepts, and distraction.
It's quite a web of interconnected ideas. The core tension seems to be between these powerful economic drivers pushing towards potential conflict and control, especially over critical resources like chips, versus new technological forces like decentralization that might offer pathways to more individual freedom.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty significant thought to grapple with.
Indeed. Considering these historical patterns of conflict, control, and economic drivers, how are today's technological leaps, both the state-controlled ones like CBDCs and AI-powered surveillance, and the decentralized ones like Bitcoin, going to reshape the incentives for global power struggles in the future?
What does that mean for individual liberty? What does it mean for global stability? As these systems evolve, what kind of world are we building?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? It's something to definitely keep thinking about.